All right, how is everyone doing today? And welcome to my channel. We do educational content on this channel, and we try to delve into great theories of everything ancient and modern, mostly obscure things, and in some cases, pretty esoteric, difficult to follow subjects. And I know that sometimes these subjects can be kind of daunting, so we're trying to make it easy as can be. Never easy, but a little bit easier path. But we look at cosmologies and grand unified theories, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries, magnum opuses, and all-encompassing theories, and then try to dig into them and figure out how to best use each one for your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health, and your paradigm shifting, and your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview. Today is our 11th video that we've done on the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception. And for those who do not know, the Dead Sea Scrolls were these ancient scrolls with text on them, discovered in Qumran, Palestine, or Transjordan in 1947, and they it's been decided that they contain biblical text, ancient Old Testament text, and they also contain a lot of material that they call sectarian material, which is stuff from the sect, this group of people that lived in this kind of monastery situation at Qumran, who they produced all of this material, and they have a lot about their own disciplines and tenets, and those are actually very important documents. And so these things were discovered, and the deception part is that it's taken so long to get these things translated and out into the public, because a group of mainly Catholic priests must not have liked something that they saw when they were translating these things, and kind of started just refusing to put them out, and telling every other scholar around the world that they don't have the right to look at these things. They held a monopoly over them, but at the same time they didn't publish anything. They published a few works, but they were mainly on the most minor aspects of the scrolls, which generally are the biblical material, the translations of all the biblical Old Testament books, which are almost identical to the ones that had already been known. But the sectarian material is where these people are explaining a lot of things in a language or a jargon that recalls this. It's the same kind of language that's used in the Gospels. So we'll get into that, but let's start right here. By the 1980s, remember they were discovered in 1947. By the mid-1980s, such opposition as existed to the international team was scattered and disorganized. Most of it found expression in the United States through a single journal, Biblical Archaeology Review. In its issue for September-October 1985, BAR reported a conference on the Dead Sea Scrolls held at New York University the previous May. It repeated the statement by Professor Morton Smith made at Morton Smith made at that conference. I thought to speak on the scandals of the Dead Sea documents, but these proved too numerous, too familiar, and too disgusting. End quote. It observed that the international team were governed, so far as can be ascertained, largely by convention, tradition, collegiality, and inertia. And it concluded, quote, the insiders, the scholars with the text assignments, the charmed circle, have the goodies to drip out bit by bit. This gives them status, scholarly power, and a wonderful ego trip. Why squander it? Obviously, the existence of this factor is controversial and disputed. BAR called attention to the residues of frustration and resentment built up among scholars of proven ability who had not been admitted to the charmed circle. It also, by implication, called attention to the benefits reaped by institutions such as Harvard University, where both Cross and Strignell were stationed, and where PET graduate students were granted access to Qumran material, while far more experienced and qualified researchers weren't. BAR ended its report by calling for immediate publication of photographs of the unpublished texts, echoing Morton Smith, who asked his colleagues to request the Israeli government, which now has ultimate authority over those scroll materials, immediately to publish photographs of all unpublished texts so that they will then be available to all scholars. That Smith's exhortation was ignored again bears witness to academic faint-heartedness. At the same time, it must be mentioned that Smith's exhortation was unfortunate in that it implicitly passed the blame from the international team, the real culprits, to the Israeli government, which had more immediate problems on its hands. The Israelis had kept their side of the bargain made in 1967 that the international team would be allowed to retain their monopoly, provided they published. The international team had not. Thus, while the Israeli government might have been irresponsible in letting the situation continue, it was not to blame for the situation itself. As Eisenman soon came to realize, most Israelis, scholars and journalists alike, as well as government figures, were appallingly ignorant about the true situation and, it must be said, indifferent to it. Through this ignorance and indifference, an outdated status quo had been allowed to continue intact. In 1985, however, the same year as the conference reported by BAR, a well-known Israeli MP, Yuval Newsome, began to take an interest in the matter, and in the process showed himself to be surprisingly well briefed. Newsome was a world-famous physicist, professor of physics, and head of the physics department at Tel Aviv University until 1971, when he became president of the university. Prior to that, he had been a military planner, one of those responsible for evolving the basic strategic thinking of the Israeli army. Between 1961 and 63, he had been scientific director of the Sorek Research Establishment, the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission. Newsome raised the issue of the scrolls in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, declaring it a scandal that the Israeli authorities had not reviewed or updated the situation, that the international team had been left with a mandate and monopoly dating from the former Jordanian regime. It was this challenge that finally forced the Israeli Department of Antiquities to investigate how and why an enclave of Catholic-oriented scholars should exercise so complete and exclusive control over what was, in effect, an Israeli state treasure. The Department of Antiquities proceeded to confront the international team on the question of publication. what accounted for the procrastination and delays, and what kind of timetable for publication could reasonably be expected. The director of the team at the time was Father Benoit, who on the 15th of September 1985 wrote to his colleagues, in this letter, a copy of which is in our possession, he reminded them of Morton Smith's call for immediate publication of photographs. He also complained, as if he were the aggrieved party, about the use of the word scandal, not just by Morton Smith, but by Newsome as well, in the Knesset. He went on to state his intention of recommending John Strugnell as chief editor of future publications, and he requested a timetable for publication from each member of the team. Compliance with Father Benoit's request was dilatory and patchy. The Department of Antiquities, prodded by Newsome, wrote to him again on December 26, 1985, repeating its request for a report and for answers to the questions it had raised. One cannot be sure whether Benoit based his reply on reliable information received from his colleagues, or whether he was simply improvising in order to buy time. But he wrote to the Department of Antiquities promising definitively that everything in the international team's possession would be published within 7 years, that is, by 1993. This timetable was submitted in writing as a binding undertaking, but of course no one took it seriously, and in personal conversation with us, Newsome stated that he heard on the grapevine that the timetable was generally regarded as a joke. It has certainly proved to be so. There is no prospect whatever of all the Qumran material, or even a reasonable part of it, appearing by 1993. Not even the whole of the material from Cave 4 has been published. Following Allegro's volume for discoveries in the Judean desert back in 1968, only 3 more have been issued in 77, 82, and 90, bringing the total number of volumes to 8. Nevertheless, the intensifying pressure engendered panic among the international team. Predictably enough, a search began for a scapegoat. Who had brought the Israeli government into the affair? Who had briefed Newsome and enabled him to raise the issue in the Knesset? Perhaps because of the repetition of the word scandal, the team concluded Giza Vermes to have been responsible. In fact, Vermes had had nothing whatever to do with the matter. It was Robert Eisenman who had briefed Newsome. Eisenman had learned from the omissions of Roth and Driver. He appreciated that the entire edifice of the international team's consensus rested on the supposedly accurate data of archaeology and paleography. Roth and Driver had correctly dismissed these data as irrelevant, but without confronting them. Eisenman resolved to challenge the international team on their own terrain by exposing the methodology and demonstrating that the resulting data were irrelevant. He opened his campaign with the book that first brought him to our attention, Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran, published by Brill in Holland in 1983. In this book, he posed the first serious challenge the international team had yet encountered to their archaeology and paleography, or eography. In his introduction, he explicitly flung down the gauntlet to the small group of specialists, largely working together, who had developed a consensus. Given the text's limited audience and circulation, of course, the international team could simply ignore the challenge. Indeed, the likelihood is that none of them read it at the time, in all probability dismissing it as a piece of ephemera by an upstart novice. Eisenman, however, refused to let his efforts be consigned to oblivion. By 1985, his second book, James the Just in the Habakkuk Pesher, had appeared in Italy, ironically under the imprint of one of the Vatican presses, Typographia Gregoriana. It carried an Italian preface, and the next year, with some additions and a revised appendix, was brought out by Brill. That same year, Eisenman was appointed fellow in residence at the prestigious Albright Institute in Jerusalem. Here he began working behind the scenes to acquaint the Israeli government with the situation and raise the scrolls on their agenda of priorities. The international team's stranglehold, he realized, could not be broken solely through decorous and even strident protests in learned journals. It would be necessary to bring external pressure to bear, preferably from above. Accordingly, Eisenman met and briefed Professor Newsome, and Newsome then forced the issue in the Knesset. Later that year, Eisenman himself approached Father Benoit and verbally requested access to the scrolls. Predictably enough, Benoit politely refused, adroitly suggesting that Eisenman should ask the Israeli authorities, and implying that the decision was not his to make. At this point, Eisenman was still unaware of the stratagems employed by the international team to thwart all applicants who wanted access to the scrolls. He was not, however, prepared to be excluded so easily. All scholars during their tenure on the staff of the Albright Institute give one lecture to the general public. Eisenman's lecture was scheduled for February 1986, and he chose as his subject the Jerusalem community and Qumran, with the provocative subtitle, Problems in Archaeology, Paleography, History, and Chronology. As in the case of his book on James, the title itself was calculated to strike a nerve. In accordance with custom, the Albright Institute sent invitations to all important scholars in the field in Jerusalem, and it was a matter of courtesy for sister institutions like the French École Biblique to be represented. 5 or 6 turned up, a higher number than usual. Since they were unfamiliar with Eisenman and his work, they may have not expected anything out of the ordinary. Gradually, however, their complacency began to crumble, and they listened to his arguments in silence. They declined to ask any questions at the end of the lecture, leaving without extending the usual courtesy of congratulations. For the first time, it had become apparent to them that in Eisenman they faced a serious challenge. True to form, they ignored it in the hope, presumably, that it would go away. The following spring, one of Eisenman's friends and colleagues, Professor Philip Davies of Sheffield University, arrived in Jerusalem for a short stay. He and Eisenman went to discuss with Megan Brochy, director of the Shrine of the Book, their desire to see the unpublished scroll fragments still sequestered by the international team. Brochy laughed at what apparently struck him as a vain hope. Quote, "You will not see these things in your lifetime," he said. In June, toward the end of his stay in Jerusalem, Eisenman was invited to tea at the house of a colleague, a professor at the Hebrew University who would later become a member of the Israeli Scroll Oversight Committee. Again, he took Davies with him. A number of other academics, including Joseph Baumgarten of Baltimore Hebrew College, were present. And early in the evening, John Struniel, Allegro's old adversary and subsequently the head of the international team, made his appearance. Boisterous and apparently intent on confrontation, he began to complain about unqualified people importunately demanding access to the Qumran material. Eisenman responded on cue. How did Struniel define qualified? Was he himself qualified? Aside from his supposed skills in analyzing handwriting, did he know anything about history? Ostensibly, it was all a half-joking, more or less civilized debate, but it was growing ominously personal. The next year, 1986-87, Eisenman spent at Oxford as senior scholar at the Oxford Center for Postgraduate Hebrew Studies and visiting member of Linacre College. Through contacts in Jerusalem, he had been given 2 secret documents. One was a copy of a scroll on which Struniel was working, part of his private fiefdom. This text, apparently by a leader of the ancient Qumran community and outlining a number of the community's governing precepts, is known by those in the field as the MMT document. Strunyel had shown it around at the 1985 conference, but had not published it, nor has he yet, though the entire text comes to a mere 121 lines. The second document was of more contemporary significance. It comprised a computer printout or list of all Qumran texts in the hands of the international team. What made it particularly important was that the international team had repeatedly denied that any such printout or list existed. Here was definitive proof that vast quantities of material had not yet been published and were being suppressed. Eisenman had no hesitation about what to do. Quote, "Since I had decided that one of the main problems between scholars, which had created this whole situation in the first place, was overprotectiveness and jealously guarded secrecy, I decided to circulate anything that came into my hands without conditions. This was the service I could render. Plus, it would determine the international cartel or monopoly of such documents. It would undermine the international cartel or monopoly of such documents." Eisenman accordingly made available a copy of the MMT document to anyone who expressed a desire to see it. These copies apparently circulated like wildfire, so much so that a year and a half later he received one back again from a third party who asked if he had seen it. He could tell by certain notations that this was one of the copies he had originally allowed to circulate. The printout, like the MMT document, was duly circulated, producing precisely the effect Eisenman had anticipated. He made a particular point of sending a copy of it to Herschel Shanks of BAR, thus providing the journal with ammunition to renew its campaign. By this time, needless to say, Eisenman's relations with the international team were deteriorating. On the surface, of course, each maintained with the other a respectable academic demeanor of frosty civility. They could not, after all, publicly attack him for his actions, which had been manifestly disinterested, manifestly in the name of scholarship. But the rift was widening between them, and it wasn't long before a calculated attempt was made to freeze him out. In January 1989, Eisenman visited Amir Drori, the newly appointed director of the Israeli Department of Antiquities. Drori inadvertently reported to Eisenman that he was about to sign an agreement with the team's new chief editor, John Strunyel. According to this agreement, the team's monopoly would be retained. The previous deadline for publication, accepted by Father Benoit, Strunyel's predecessor, was to be abrogated. All remaining Qumran material was to be published not by 1993, but by 1996. Eisenman was naturally appalled. Attempts to dissuade Drori, however, proved futile. Eisenman left the meeting determined to employ a new and more drastic stratagem. The only means of bringing pressure to bear on both the international team and on the Department of Antiquities, and perhaps stop Drori from proceeding with the contract, would be Israel's High Court of Justice, which dealt with miscarriages of justice and private appeals from individuals. Eisenman explored the question with lawyers. Yes, they concluded, the High Court might be persuaded to intervene. In order for it to do so, however, Eisenman would have to present it with proof of a miscarriage of justice. He would have to show, preferably in writing, that access to the scrolls by a legitimate scholar had been refused. At the time, no such record existed, not at least in the legalistic sense the court would require. Other scholars had, of course, been refused access to the scrolls, but some of them were dead, others were scattered across the world, and there was none of the required documentation. Struniel would therefore have to be approached with a series of new requests for access to specific materials, which, as a foregone conclusion, he would refuse. Now that Eisenman had the catalog numbers, his task would be easier. Not wishing to make this request alone, Eisenman felt it would be more impressive if he enlisted the support of others. He approached Philip Davies of Sheffield, who agreed to support him in what both recognized would be only the first shot of a prolonged engagement fought through the Israeli High Court. On March 16, 1989, two professors submitted a formal letter to John Struniel. They requested access to certain original fragments and photographs of fragments found at the Qumran site designated Cave 4 and listed in the computer printout which Eisenman had leaked into circulation. In order to preclude any misunderstanding, they cited the reference numbers assigned by the printout to the photographs, to the photographic negatives. They also requested access to a number of scroll commentaries or commentary fragments related to the primary text. They offered to pay all costs involved and promised not to publish any definitive transcription or translation of the material, which would be used only in their own research. They promised, too, to abide by all the normal procedures of copyright law. In their letter, Eisenman and Davies acknowledged the time and energy expended over the years by the international team, but they said they felt the team had already been adequately compensated by enjoying such long and exclusive access to the Qumran material. They stated that 35 to 40 years was long enough for other scholars to have waited for similar access, without which we can no longer make meaningful progress in our endeavors. The letter continued, quote, surely your original commission was to publish these materials as quickly as possible for the benefit of the scholarly community as a whole, not to control them. It would have been different, perhaps, if you and your scholars had discovered these materials in the first place, but you did not. They were simply assigned to you. The situation as it now stands is abnormal in the extreme. Therefore, as mature scholars, at the height of our powers and abilities, we feel it is an imposition upon us and a hardship to ask us to wait any longer for the research availability of and access to these materials 40 years after their discovery. Eisenman and Davies expected Struniel to refuse their request. Struniel, however, did not bother to reply at all. On May 2nd, therefore, Eisenman wrote to Amir Drori, who earlier that year had renewed the international team's monopoly with the publication deadline of 1996. Eisenman enclosed a copy of the letter to Struniel, mentioning that it had been posted to both of Struniel's addresses at Harvard and in Jerusalem. Of Struniel's failure to reply, he wrote, quote, frankly, we are tired of being treated contemptuously. This kind of cavalier treatment is not really a new phenomenon, but is part and parcel of the process that has been going on for 20 to 30 years or more. End quote. Since Struniel would not grant access to the Qumran material, Eisenman requested that Drori, exercising a higher authority, should do so. He then made two particularly important points. As long as the international team continued to control the Qumran texts, it would not be sufficient merely to speed up the publication schedule. Nothing short of free scholarly access would be satisfactory to check the international team's conclusions. To allow for variations in the translation and interpretation, to discern connections the team themselves might perhaps have overlooked. Quote, we cannot be sure that they have exhausted all possible fragments in relation to a given document, or that they are putting fragments together in proper sequence. Nor can we be sure if the inventories are in fact complete and that fragments may not have been lost, destroyed, or overlooked in some manner or for some reason. Only the whole of the interested scholarly community working together can assure this. The second point would appear, at least with hindsight, to be self-evident. The international team insisted on the importance of archaeology and paleography. It was on the basis of their supposedly accurate archaeological and paleographical studies, as Eisenman had explained, that dates for the Qumran texts had been posited and accepted. Yet the texts themselves had been subject only to carbon dating tests in use at around the time of the scroll's discovery, tests which were very clumsy and consumed much manuscript material. Lest too much text be lost, therefore, only some of the wrappings found in the jars had been tested. These confirmed a date around the beginning of the Christian era. None of the texts had been tested by the more recent techniques of carbon-14 dating, even though carbon-14 dating had now been refined by the newer AMS, accelerator mass spectroscopy technique. Little material would now be lost in the process and greater accuracy could be achieved. Eisenman, therefore, suggested that Drury exercise his authority and perform new, up-to-date tests. He also recommended that outsiders be brought into the process to keep it fair. He concluded his letter with a passionate appeal. Please act to release these materials to interested scholars who need them to proceed with professional research without prejudice and without distinction immediately. No doubt prompted by Drury, Struniel, in Jerusalem at the time, at last replied on May 15th. Despite the fact that Eisenman's letter to him had been posted to his address at both Harvard and Jerusalem, he blamed the delay on its having been sent to the wrong country. Okay, we will review Dr. Struniel's response to Eisenman when we return tomorrow. So please join me then. And thanks for tuning in today.